You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Founded in 1881, the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War is a congressionally chartered, charitable, fraternal organization that preserves the history and legacy of the Union veterans who fought during the Civil War to save the Union and end slavery.
When you join, you enter a national network of men who form lifelong bonds, honor their heroic ancestors, and promote historic preservation, education, and patriotism in their communities.
The Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War accepts both descendants of Civil War veterans and non-descendants. Visit them today at www.suvcw.org or email them at join@suvcw.org.
The views, information, or opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the SUVCW.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode 457 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, welcome to the show.
As you guys will recall, with last week's show, we gave some background to Sherman's raid on Meridian, Mississippi in February 1864. And if we didn't know before that William Tecumseh Sherman was a polarizing figure, then we certainly would have after reading the comments on Facebook. In fact, once it became obvious there were a fair number of people incapable of having a civil discussion about him, we turned off the comments on the post. And we blocked a few of the more obnoxious jerks, which is strangely satisfying in an omnipotent sort of way. In any case,
at the end of the last episode, we said that we'd use this show to take a closer look at the change that took place in Sherman's thinking about how to prosecute the war. It had taken the course of the entire war to change him from an officer who sought to exclude civilians from harm to becoming a commander who actively searched for ways to break the morale of the Confederate civilians, bringing them to the point they would stop supporting the war.
Roughly 7 months after the fall of Vicksburg, when Sherman marched across central Mississippi, he was intent on undermining that region's ability to support future Confederate military operations. Sherman's target was the rail hub of Meridian, but his troops tore up railroad tracks and burned military supplies all along their route. And this was typical of armies marching through enemy territory in the Civil War.
What made the Meridian operation different is that for the first time, federal troops were instructed to include Confederate civilians and their property in their campaign of destruction.
Besides seizing and or destroying physical property, such as and forage, that might be used to support rebel military operations in the region, there was also a psychological component to waging war in this way, in that the Federals were intent on quashing any hope the people in Mississippi might have had of a Confederate victory. In this sense, the raid on Meridian was a model for Sherman's own march to the sea through Georgia and then into South Carolina, and for Phil Sheridan's activities in the Shenandoah Valley.
It was on the Meridian raid in February 1864 that Sherman greatly altered the way he waged war. However, he didn't develop this style of warfare in a month or even a year.
Instead, it took the course of the entire war up to that point to change Sherman from being an officer who sought to exclude civilians from the conflict to becoming a commander who actively searched for ways to terrorize Confederate civilians into giving up on their cause.
During the first year of the war, William Tecumseh Sherman considered it his soldierly duty to ensure the proper treatment of Southern civilians and their property. He took great care in seeing that his policies and the conduct of his troops didn't trample upon the perceived rights of Confederate civilians. He handed out harsh punishment to soldiers who did as little as steal fence rails for their campfires.
However, by the end of the war, most Southerners saw Sherman as the devil incarnate for his harsh treatment of Confederate civilians and his destruction of property. His bummers became notorious for their ability to strip the countryside, taking and destroying food and supplies, and punishing Southern civilians for supporting the Confederacy.
The pivotal circumstances in Sherman's transformation came because of his dealings with Confederate guerrillas along the Mississippi River and his participation in Grant's attempts to get at Vicksburg in 1862 and 1863.
While Sherman was in Memphis in 1862 and 63, guarding that important river town and the Mississippi River, he battled constantly with guerrillas and enemy cavalry operating in western Tennessee and northern Mississippi. After exhausting all conventional methods for dealing with these threats, he began to strike at the local southern towns, which he considered the supply bases for the rebels.
By targeting the towns, Sherman was attempting to prevent the Confederates from sustaining the fight, while simultaneously punishing the civilians for supporting the enemy.
Although he experienced only limited success with this strategy, Sherman nonetheless believed that the key to protecting the Union's hold on the Mississippi River was to strike at the enemy's resources. In Sherman's mind, if the guerrillas and rebel cavalry couldn't find supplies or support among the Southern populace, then they couldn't remain a threat to the river.
Sherman therefore created a plan to destroy the rail lines in Mississippi, hoping to cripple the enemy's ability to sustain military operations in the Magnolia State. If the Confederate threat to the Mississippi was removed, then thousands of Federal troops garrisoning points along the river could be used on battlefields elsewhere.
In the last show, we talked about how, when Sherman recaptured the state capital of Jackson in July 1863, after the fall of Vicksburg, he would have liked to continue east to the important rail hub of Meridian, but he realized that he hadn't brought sufficient supplies for an extended foray into enemy territory. In addition, he was worried a march across the Magnolia State in August would sap the strength of his men as the scorching heat and oppressive humidity took its toll on them. In the end, Sherman returned to Vicksburg after laying waste to Jackson, but he didn't give up on his idea of moving against Meridian.
Once the weather cooled off, though, events in Tennessee, particularly the Federal predicament at Chattanooga, meant any plans Sherman had in Mississippi had to be put on the back burner, as he and a significant portion of his command marched east to aid Grant's efforts to turn the tide in the volunteer state in the Federals' favor.
But then, as the calendar turned over from 1863 to 1864, with Chattanooga saved, and with Washington having vetoed Ulysses S. Grant's wish to make an attack on Mobile, Grant gave Sherman the green light to go ahead with his plan to move against Meridian.
In July 1863, just after the fall of Vicksburg, as he revisited Jackson, Sherman conducted a campaign of destruction designed to render the Mississippi state capital unusable to the Confederate Army. The raid on Meridian in February 1864 was his attempt to wreak the same type of havoc upon an entire region in order to cripple the enemy's ability to sustain military operations in the Magnolia State.
With the raid on Meridian, Sherman adapted what he'd learned during the first 3 years of the war into a new style of campaigning that he hoped would end the conflict as quickly and bloodlessly as possible.
He wanted to quash the enemy's ability and will to continue the fight without having to engage in bloody battles with Confederate armies or garrison large areas of the Southern heartland.
Although he attended West Point, Sherman didn't get his ideas for this new style of warfare from his education there. Most professional military officers, many of whom attended West Point, had studied the works of Baron Antoine-Henri de Jomini. Jomini's The Art of War wasn't translated into English until 1854, but most military theorists of that era drew upon his work for their own writings. So, even though cadets at West Point during Sherman's time may not have actually read Jomini, their instructors would have certainly been familiar with and been influenced by his work. In any case, not to get too far off in the weeds with Jomini, but he contended that while the violence between two opposing armies on the battlefield had few limitations, civilians should be excluded from harm. His comments about guerrillas implied condemnation of their style of warfare.
Early in the Civil War, Sherman agreed with Jomini that there were definite boundaries between the warring armies and civilian population, which must be respected. After the First Battle of Bull Run, Sherman wrote to his wife about the depredations some of his troops had committed. Quote, "If a private thinks it's right, he takes the oats and corn and even burns the house of his enemy. No Goths or Vandals ever had less respect for lives and property."
Such behavior angered Sherman because he believed it was not only detrimental to military discipline, but he thought that it harmed the Union cause. When he became commander of the Department of the Cumberland later that year, he compensated Kentucky's civilians for the property federal soldiers secured for military use. He thought this was the best way to keep border state civilians from supporting the Confederacy. A northern newspaper declared that Sherman's policy had, quote, produced a marked change in favor of the Union cause.
But in July 1862, Sherman reported an incident involving a band of rebel guerrillas in Tennessee attacking federal wagons out gathering forage. He believed they were a band of local citizens from nearby LaGrange, so he ordered the seizure of 25 of the quote-unquote most prominent men from the town and had them transported to Columbus, Tennessee as prisoners.
He reported, quote, "I am satisfied we have no other remedy for this ambush firing than to hold the neighborhood fully responsible, though the punishment may fall on the wrong parties." End quote. So Sherman had no way of knowing exactly who was responsible for the attack, but he insisted that the locals certainly knew the identity of the bushwhackers, and so if they refused to assist in the apprehension of the culprits, then they would suffer the consequences.
The following month, in the summer of 1862, because of the distances involved in transporting supplies to federal forces in the Western Theater, and because of the vulnerability of supply lines and depots to enemy cavalry attacks, the War Department in Washington began to endorse foraging to offset the resulting shortages in provisions.
The War Department issued General Orders 107 and 108, spelling out the idea that if private property was seized in an quote-unquote orderly manner and not, quote, pillaged, then it was officially acceptable to confiscate it, quote, for the subsistence and other uses of the army.
At the time, Sherman didn't like the policy set forth in General Orders 107 and 108. believing that liberal foraging would lead the men down the path to outright looting and plundering. He issued an order against the, quote, demoralizing and disgraceful practice of pillaging.
Sherman insisted that while troops were on the move in enemy territory, Union cavalry must arrest any stragglers caught pillaging, and warned that any soldiers captured while engaged in such activity would be punished.
This episode of the podcast is sponsored by the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War.
Do you have an interest in the Civil War? Founded in 1881, the SUV-CW is a congressionally chartered, charitable, fraternal organization that preserves the history and legacy of the Union veterans who fought during the Civil War to save the Union and end slavery.
The national headquarters of the SUV-CW is located at the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. When you join, you enter a national network of men who form lifelong bonds, honor their heroic ancestors, and promote historic preservation, education, and patriotism in their communities.
The SUV-CW is the heir to the legacy of the Grand Army of the Republic, the famous post-war National Association of Union Civil War Veterans. Based on the principles of fraternity, charity, and loyalty, the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War accepts both descendants of Civil War veterans and non-descendants. Visit them today at www.suvcw.org or email them at join@suvcw.org.
The views, information, or opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the SUV-CW.
This episode is brought to you by U.S. Cellular. When you're out exploring or on an adventure, you want to stay connected, keeping friends and family posted on what you're up to. U.S. Cellular keeps you connected on their great 5G network, even in hard-to-reach places, like when you're out hiking or visiting family out in the middle of nowhere. And now you can get 2 lines of unlimited data for just $60 a month. Get 2 lines for $60 so you can stay connected to the people who matter most. Visit uscellular.com for details.
That same month, during the summer of 1862, in which he expressed his displeasure with the Army's new policy regarding foraging, Sherman became acutely concerned about the irksome and infuriating guerrilla activity in his area of responsibility.
The rebel guerrillas regularly attacked federal wagon trains and isolated outposts. When Union forces were sent out to confront the guerrillas, the enemy simply faded into the countryside, either returning to their homes or hiding out in remote camps. Increasingly irritated by this frustrating state of affairs, Sherman began to harden his attitude toward Confederate civilians, who he felt provided aid and comfort to the rebel bushwhackers. He wrote angrily, quote, "All the people are now guerrillas."
Sherman decided that if the guerrillas hid among and were supported by civilians, then the federal military was justified in punishing the local populace. Sherman wrote, "If the farmers in a neighborhood encourage or even permit in their midst a set of guerrillas, they cannot escape the necessary consequences. It is not our wish or policy to destroy the farmers or their farms, but of course there is and must be remedy for all evils."
Sherman remained steadfast in his belief that wanton destruction of private property was wrong, but he now believed the quote-unquote exigencies of war forced him to take a new approach. He declared that those who resided in areas where bushwhackers operated were, quote, accessories by their presence and inactivity to prevent murders and destruction and property, end quote. They could therefore expect retribution to be visited upon them.
Sherman was especially incensed by Confederate guerrillas firing on Union shipping on the Mississippi River. In September 1862, from his headquarters at Memphis, he ordered Colonel Charles Walcott, commander of the 46th Ohio, to march to the town of Randolph, Tennessee. The day before, rebel bushwhackers had fired on the Union supply ship Eugene as she steamed south on the Mississippi.
Sherman told Walcott that he thought, quote, the attack on the Eugene was by a small force of guerrillas from Loosahachie, who by this time have gone back, and therefore you will find no one at Randolph, in which case you will destroy the place, leaving one house to mark the place. End quote. So while Sherman may not have been able to capture those directly responsible for firing on the Eugene, he could, as a deterrent to others who may contemplate such activity, punish those who, in his mind, were accessories to the crime. To this end, he told Walcott, let the people know and feel that we deeply deplore the necessity of such destruction, but must protect ourselves and the boats. All such acts as cowardly as firing upon boats must be severely punished.
Sherman considered such guerrilla activity so far beyond the scope of proper military conduct that he was justified in using extraordinary measures, including the destruction of civilian property, to stop such actions.
Sherman informed Grant of the destruction of Randolph and said he intended to threaten the enemy with harsher measures if they persisted in their attacks on Union shipping. Quote, I have given public notice that a repetition will justify any measures of retaliation, such as loading the boats with guerrilla prisoners where they would receive fire, and expelling families from the comforts of Memphis.
In October, another attack led Sherman to order Walcott to, quote, destroy all the houses, farms, and cornfields, end quote, along a 15-mile stretch of the river. After several more attacks, he made good on his promise to expel families from Memphis and send them beyond the Union lines.
While moving south down the Mississippi from Memphis in December, as part of Grant's movement against Vicksburg that winter, Sherman continued his policy of punishing civilians for any sniping against Union shipping. He issued an order to his troops stating that, if fired upon, a landing should be made and soldiers should burn, quote, the neighboring houses, barns, etc., end quote, while taking any supplies, quote, useful to the United States.
To a friend, Sherman later described his transformation in 1862. Quote, early in the war, I would not let our men burn a fence rail for fire or gather fruits or vegetables, though hungry. We, at the time, were restrained, tied to a deep-seated reverence for law and property. The rebels first introduced terror as part of their system. No military man could endure this for long, and we were forced in self-defense to imitate their example.
That winter and spring, during Grant's attempts to get at Vicksburg, Sherman learned an important lesson that would prove extremely valuable in his later campaigns and would change the way he would prosecute the war against the Confederacy.
Earlier in 1862, prior to Shiloh, Sherman had observed the differences in how two parts of the opposing armies approached the area where the battle would be fought. On the Federal side, he noted that Don Carlos Buell, quote, had to move at a snail's pace with his vast wagon trains, end quote, while on the Confederate side, Braxton Bragg, quote, moved rapidly, living on the country.
However, Sherman remained unsure whether a Federal army could live off the hostile countryside as successfully as the enemy's army had done in its own territory. Then, in late December, after Ulysses S. Grant had moved down into northern Mississippi from western Tennessee, a raid by Confederate cavalry led by Earl Van Dorn destroyed Grant's big supply base at Holly Springs, Mississippi. Grant was forced to call off his advance down into northern Mississippi, but before he gave up, he wanted to see if he could reestablish his supply line so that he could continue the campaign. In the meantime, he ordered his men to live off the countryside. He was surprised to discover that his army lived well from what they found on northern Mississippi's farms. Grant later commented in his memoirs, "I was amazed at the quantity of supplies the country afforded. It showed me that we could have subsisted off the country for 2 months instead of 2 weeks."
Sherman, like his friend Grant, took the lesson to heart. He understood that by not having to maintain a supply line, soldiers previously used to guard that line could instead be used at the tip of the spear. Furthermore, the Federal Army could move through and subsist in enemy territory at the expense of the hostile countryside, while simultaneously ensuring valuable provisions wouldn't be available for use by the Confederate military.
As you guys know from our Vicksburg story arc here on the podcast, in the spring of 1863, after Grant had marched his army down the west side of the Mississippi to a point below Vicksburg and then transported it to the east side of the river, he didn't advance directly on his target, but instead marched up into the interior of Mississippi, largely living off the land while he did so. As part of this movement, he sent Sherman off to the east, to Jackson, to remove or destroy any military supplies there, and in that way protect his, that is, Grant's, rear while he went after Vicksburg.
During this first visit to Jackson, Sherman did, by and large, limit himself to collecting supplies and destroying property, such as railroad bridges, that could be used by or benefit the Confederate military. But he cautioned that, quote, "the private rights of citizens must be respected."
However, when Grant ordered Sherman back to Jackson after the fall of Vicksburg, it was another story. Grant ordered Sherman to, quote, "leave nothing of value for the enemy to carry on the war with," end quote. And Sherman took those orders to the extreme, reporting to Grant that his troops were wreaking havoc not just in the state capital, but throughout the surrounding countryside. Sherman reported that his men were, quote, "absolutely stripping the country of corn, cattle, hogs, sheep, poultry, everything."
He admitted, quote, "the wholesale destruction to which this country is now being subjected is terrible to contemplate, but it's the scourge of war, and weakening the resources of our enemy is being executed with rigor."
Sherman reported, quote, "Jackson, once the pride and boast of Mississippi, is now a ruined town and ceases to be a place for the enemy to collect stores and men from which to threaten our great river," end quote. And here again was evidence of Sherman's concern for the Union's hold on the Mississippi River.
As we know, Sherman wanted to march on Meridian that summer after he dealt with Jackson, since he believed that if he could visit destruction upon Meridian, as he'd just done to Jackson, it would not only cripple future rebel operations in Mississippi, but by destroying a major rail hub, it would also be a blow to the larger Confederate war effort.
Well, as it turned out, Sherman's movement against Meridian was delayed until February 1864, by which time he intended that the expedition would not merely be a strike aimed at destroying the rail hub there, but would be a devastating march across Mississippi, attempting to thoroughly and systematically render an entire region incapable of aiding rebel guerrillas or supporting Confederate military operations.
Sherman intended to cut a destructive path across the state of Mississippi to Meridian and then back to Vicksburg, wreaking havoc upon the enemy's resources and psyche. The Federal columns carrying out the raid would confiscate, burn, and destroy anything that might help the Confederate cause.
Injuring civilians was still prohibited, but harm would certainly be visited upon them through the seizure and or destruction of any private property that was deemed useful to the federal military or that might benefit the Confederate war effort. Sherman had lived in the South before the war and believed he understood the Southern mind. This led him to conclude that breaking the will of Southern civilians to the point they were willing to give up on the Confederate cause would serve to shorten the war, and so, along with destroying the enemy's resources, it needed to be an essential component of any federal strategy moving forward.
To Sherman's way of thinking, visiting harm upon Southern civilians was also preferable to paying the bloody butcher's bills that resulted when the opposing armies battled one another.
The raid on Meridian in February 1864 was the next step in Sherman's evolving philosophy toward the prosecution of the war. His dealings with rebel guerrillas in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Mississippi had hardened his attitude toward non-combatants. Grant's experiences living off the land had given Sherman the confidence to cast loose from traditional supply lines. And he had come to believe that the best way to end the war quickly was to destroy the enemy's resources. With the next episode, we'll look at Sherman's raid on Meridian, see how the operation demonstrated his complete change of attitude toward the prosecution of the war, and understand that it was very much a dress rehearsal for his march to the sea through Georgia.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is William Tecumseh Sherman, In the Service of My Country, A Life, by James Lee McDonough.
You can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org. Also at the website, you can find information on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like our newest members, Stephen S., Ryan L., and Little Boba.
At the website, you can always also make a one-time donation, just like Ann H. did this past week. So a big thank you to Ann.
We know a lot of listeners here in the States are right in the midst of enjoying a 3-day weekend because of Memorial Day tomorrow. A 3-day weekend is always a good thing, but it's also important here with Memorial Day to be mindful why we have this holiday. That is to remember and honor the memory of the service members who throughout our nation's history have lost their lives securing the freedoms we enjoy each day as Americans. And in these times in which we live, we certainly don't take those freedoms for granted. So all of that's to say that while we hope you get to enjoy this 3-day weekend, we also hope you take some time to actually celebrate Memorial Day. Well, anyway,
thanks to all of you for listening to this episode. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks everyone. Bye.